She said the cabin wasn't mine, that the HOA didn't allow people like me up here alone. But when she called the cops to scare me off, she didn't know who owned the land beneath her feet, or the deed I kept folded in my back pocket. Like stories where the quiet ones win big? Hit that like button and subscribe. We've got plenty more comebacks you'll never see coming. The road wound like a ribbon through the hills, curling past the edge of the pines and brushing up against the lake every few miles. I hadn't been up this way in more than a decade, not since the funeral. But even after all that time, the gravel still crunched the same beneath my tires, and the trees still leaned in like old friends trying to catch a whisper. I rolled the window down and let the breeze slap my face, cool and sharp with pine and memory. The lake always had a kind of quiet that didn't feel empty. It was a stillness full of breath. When I was a boy, Granddad used to say the land held stories, that the stones remembered who walked on them. I wasn't sure I believed that back then, but something about coming back made me wonder if maybe they'd been waiting. Maybe the trees missed me, or maybe I just missed the way things were when life made sense. The truck bed rattled with old tools and a folded cot. I wasn't planning anything fancy. Just me, the cabin, and time to figure out what came next. The deed was tucked in my glove box, the edges worn soft from the number of times I'd unfolded and refolded it. I didn't need it, not really. The cabin was mine. Had been mine since the day Granddad left it to me. But something told me it was better to have the paper in hand, just in case. I turned off the main road onto Pineshore Drive, the gravel thinner, the trees closer. The sky peaked in small slivers now, and I could see the shimmer of the lake through the trunks. A few homes dotted the hillside, newer builds with big decks and fancy SUVs in the driveways. I didn't recognize any of them. Back when I was a kid, there were only 4 families on this stretch. Folks who knew how to gut a fish and keep quiet at sunrise. Now it looked like a brochure for a retirement catalogue. When the cabin came into view, I slowed the truck to a crawl. The old place was still standing, just like I remembered. Weather-worn and leaning a little on one side, but the porch swing was still hanging and the stone chimney still held its shape. The flagpole was gone, though. The one Granddad used to fly the stars and stripes from every morning. Only the rusted bracket remained, bent sideways near the roof. I parked just off the gravel and cut the engine. The silence after the hum of the truck was near perfect. No traffic, no phones, just the gentle hush of leaves shifting and the occasional bird call. I stepped out and stretched my back, joints crackling like dry twigs. Then I walked slowly to the porch and placed my palm against the cabin door, half expecting it to breathe back. A voice cut through the air behind me, not loud but sharp. "Excuse me? Can I help you?" I turned. A woman was standing a few yards off near the tree line, arms folded, mouth pinched. She wore a pastel windbreaker and white sneakers that hadn't seen a speck of dirt. Her hair was stiff, her expression stiffer. I didn't recognize her, but she looked at me like she expected me to explain myself. "Just getting settled," I said, nodding toward the cabin. Her eyes narrowed. "This is private property. HOA regulations don't allow unauthorized use of vacant lots, and we've had issues with squatters before." I felt the first flicker of irritation rise but kept my voice calm. "It's not vacant. This is my family's place. Been ours since the 50s. She blinked, then took a step forward. "Oh? Name?" I gave it to her. She squinted like the name was written somewhere behind my eyes. Then her mouth twisted into something that tried to pass for polite but didn't quite make it. "I'm Karen Lewis, president of the Pineshore Lake Homeowners Association. You should have notified us before arriving. There are protocols." I didn't know that visiting my own cabin required permission. She smiled tightly. "Well, things have changed. We've worked hard to keep this area safe and orderly. I'll be watching to make sure the standards are maintained." With that, she turned and walked off, clipboard swinging at her side like it held the law itself. I stood there for a moment, the breeze lifting a few loose hairs off my forehead. Then I turned the key in the lock and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust and time, but it was mine, and I wasn't going anywhere. The next morning started quiet, the kind of still that settles in just after sunrise. Mist hovered over the lake like a breath the world hadn't let out yet. I sat on the porch with an enamel mug of coffee, the same one Granddad used to use. The swing creaked softly beneath me as I watched a single duck cut a V across the water. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe without checking over my shoulder. That feeling didn't last long. I heard the footsteps before I saw her. Shoes too clean for dirt, heels striking the wood like punctuation. I looked up and there she was again, the woman from yesterday, standing at the bottom step of the porch with that same folded arm posture and pinched smile. The clipboard was back, tucked under one arm like it held gospel truth. "Good morning," she said, in a tone that barely passed for neighborly. "I figured I'd stop by first thing. We have some things to clarify." I took a sip of my coffee and nodded. "Sure. What's on your mind?" She stepped up onto the first porch step, uninvited. "As I mentioned, I'm the HOA president. We've had increasing issues with unauthorized occupants, subletting, and frankly, people attempting to claim property without proper standing. This is a community, sir. It operates on mutual respect and clear rules." I didn't move. This place was deeded to me by my grandfather. I've got all the paperwork. She gave a short, practiced laugh. "Oh, I'm sure you do, but we still require all residents, even legacy claimants, to register their occupancy with the board. We need to ensure that you're, well, suitable." "Suitable?" I asked. The word felt strange in my mouth, like I'd picked it up off the ground and wasn't sure it belonged to me. She nodded, tilting her head slightly. "Single occupancy male, with no prior community involvement. And frankly, we've never seen you before. People talk. There's concern." I stood slowly, setting the mug down on the porch rail. I didn't want trouble, not on my first full day back, but I'd seen enough men let people like her talk them into silence. Grandad always said there are some folks who only understand presence, not permission. "I've got the deed," I said. "County clerk has a record of transfer. The taxes are paid. I've done everything I'm supposed to do." She pursed her lips, as if I'd spoken out of turn. "Yes, well, sometimes people do what's technically allowed without doing what's appropriate. We've cultivated a certain atmosphere here. People keep their lawns neat. Noise is kept to a minimum. No visible tools or machinery on the porch. No excessive signage, flags, or, well, symbols." I followed her eyes to the folded tarp by the door and the stack of firewood beside it. I hadn't gotten around to moving it yet. She looked at it like it was a pile of tires on a front lawn. A flag hung above the door in a glass frame. My grandfather's unit patch, faded by decades of sun. She saw that too. "I'll keep things tidy," I said, "but I'm not here to impress anybody." That seemed to strike a nerve. She stepped fully onto the porch now, closer than I liked. Her eyes scanned the cabin like she was assessing damages she planned to report. Then she smiled, small and rehearsed. "You know, we do background checks on most residents. It's a simple courtesy, keeps the neighborhood safe." "Safe from what?" I asked. She didn't answer. Instead, she glanced at her watch. "There's an HOA meeting this Friday evening at the community center. Attendance is strongly encouraged. If you'd like to make a good impression, that would be the place to start. People are curious and, well, not everyone responds kindly to strangers showing up without warning." I didn't say anything. I didn't have to. She stepped back, clearly not pleased she hadn't gotten more from me. As she turned to go, she tossed one more comment over her shoulder like a bone for a dog she didn't want to pet. "Just remember, Mr. Ellis, this place has standards. We all worked hard to build something respectable here. Don't be the reason it starts to slip." I watched her go, her windbreaker crinkling with every stiff movement. She walked like someone who believed the world owed her a thank you just for showing up. When she disappeared behind the trees, I picked up the mug again and sat down. The coffee had gone cold, but I drank it anyway. It was going to be a long summer. I could already feel it. She was back before noon, this time with a clipboard in one hand, and a man trailing behind her who looked like he hadn't wanted to come. He was older, heavy-set, and wore a baseball cap with a faded insurance logo on the front. His eyes darted around the property like he was checking for something broken before he'd even been asked to fix it. She led the way, chin high, eyes sharp. I didn't need a second guess to know this wasn't a neighborly visit. I was sitting on the steps, sharpening an old hatchet with slow, even strokes. The blade had been dull since I found it in the shed that morning, still wrapped in an oily rag the way Grandad used to store his tools. I didn't stand when she arrived, didn't smile either. "Mr. Ellis," she said, her voice high and tight. "This is Mr. Howard. He's from our compliance committee." The man offered a weak nod and a small grunt. Karen didn't wait for a response. "We're conducting a courtesy walkthrough," she continued. "There have been concerns raised already about your arrival, and we're obligated to investigate property compliance issues before they escalate." I looked at the two of them standing on the dirt like they were visiting a crime scene. Then I pulled the deed from my back pocket, unfolded it slowly, and held it out to her with both hands. The corners were soft, creased from years of being read and reread, but the ink was clear and bold. My grandfather's name was right there, alongside mine, and the county stamp was fresh. "You keep that in your pocket?" she asked, raising her brows like I'd just handed her a dead snake. "Only since yesterday," I said. "Didn't think I'd need it, but seems I was wrong." She didn't reach for it, just gave it a quick glance and then looked to Mr. Howard, who was shifting from foot to foot like a man trying not to be noticed. "You understand," she said, "that ownership alone doesn't exempt you from community expectations. Expectations are one thing, legal standing is another." Her lips thinned, and for a second, the wind picked up through the trees and we all went silent. The leaves hissed above us. The lake shimmered in the distance. Karen turned her attention to the shed beside the cabin. "That structure is non-compliant with current height and siding codes," she said, "and those firewood stacks are considered outdoor clutter. My grandfather built that shed in 1963, I replied, "and the firewood is for the stove, not decoration." "It's not about the age of the structure," she snapped. "It's about aesthetic standards and safety. We've had fires before, you know." Mr. Howard finally spoke. "Maybe we could give him a 30-day window to—" Karen cut him off. "I don't think that's necessary. If we don't act early, we send the wrong message to everyone." She turned back to me with a smile that felt like the start of a fight. "We'll be filing a formal notice. It's not personal, of course. Just policy." I nodded once and folded the deed again, slipping it back into my pocket. "File what you like," I said, "but I'm not going anywhere, and neither is this cabin." That was when something shifted in her face. The polite front cracked just a little, like glass fogging up in cold air. Maybe it was the calm in my voice. Maybe it was the way Mr. Howard was now pretending to study the tree line instead of backing her up. "I hope you'll reconsider attending the HOA meeting," she said finally. "A good relationship with the community starts with participation." I didn't answer, just picked up the hatchet again and went back to sharpening. The sound of the stone dragging across metal filled the silence between us. After a long pause, they turned and walked back the way they came. Karen's steps were clipped and fast, Mr. Howard's lagging behind. When they were out of sight, I set the blade down and leaned back on my hands. The sky was clear above, the kind of blue that made you believe in starting fresh. But something told me this wasn't going to blow over like a summer storm. Karen wasn't just trying to enforce rules, she was trying to send a message. I wasn't sure yet what she thought I represented, but it was clear she wanted me gone. The deed stayed in my pocket all day. It felt heavier than paper, like memory, like promise, like a line I wasn't going to let anyone cross. The sun slipped behind the ridge slowly, drawing long shadows across the gravel and the porch. That old cabin always took on a different kind of quiet at night. Not the peaceful kind, but the heavy kind. The kind that presses against the windows and listens to every board that creaks under your feet. I'd almost forgotten how dark it got out here without neighbors nearby, without streetlights, without the glow of town leaking through the trees. I lit the lantern that hung by the stove and sat at the little table in the front room, thumbing through the yellowed ledger my grandfather had used to track repairs and weather notes. He had written things like, "April 3 raccoons in the shed again," and "November 14th ice, early this year, chimney holds." Simple things. Ordinary. The kind of life no one writes songs about, but the kind that built something steady. The radio wouldn't pick up anything but static. No cell signal either. I didn't mind. Solitude never scared me. But tonight felt different, and I couldn't quite put my finger on it. It wasn't just the silence. It was the way it moved. I was halfway through heating a can of beans when the lights flickered and went out. The lantern stayed lit, casting long gold shadows across the walls. I checked the fuse box, but everything looked fine. That didn't make sense. I stepped outside with the flashlight, scanning the edges of the cabin. The line hadn't fallen. No obvious damage. Still, the power was gone. As I stood there on the porch, I heard something behind the trees. A crack, like a footstep snapping a dry branch. Then stillness. Not the kind that settles after a sound, but the kind that waits to see what you'll do next. I slowly backed into the cabin, shut the door, and slid the old bolt across the frame. Then I pulled the .22 rifle down from the hooks above the fireplace. Granddad's rifle. Light as memory, but solid in my hands. I hadn't touched it in years. The wood felt dry, the metal cool. I loaded it slowly, every motion deliberate, the way he taught me. The sound came again, closer this time. Then silence. Then the bark of a dog, sharp and distant, followed by a pause that lasted too long. No wind, no crickets. Just the feeling of being watched. I moved through the cabin, checking each window, careful not to let the lantern cast my shadow where it didn't need to be. I didn't see anything outside, but I knew someone had been there. I knew that kind of quiet. It was the kind that followed you home. A loud crack came from the side of the cabin. I stepped onto the porch and swept the light toward the corner. The bulb in the porch light was shattered, glass scattered across the steps. No sign of anyone. Just the broken shell of a light I hadn't even turned on yet. I didn't sleep much that night. I sat in the old armchair near the front window, the rifle across my lap, listening. Every rustle became a question. Every creak became a reason to breathe slower. I thought of the ledger. I thought of my grandfather standing here, maybe hearing the same sounds, maybe facing the same kind of people. They wanted me out. That much was clear, and someone was willing to make that known without knocking on the door. I watched the trees until the night finally gave way to grey. The mist was already lifting from the lake. Birds started up again, timid at first, then in full chorus. It was morning. I had made it through. But the message had been sent, and I wasn't going to ignore it. I woke stiff, knees aching from the weight of the rifle across my lap and the way I'd drifted off upright in the armchair. The morning sun crept in through the window, low and pale. Outside, the world looked as if nothing had happened. Birds picked at pine cones. The lake stretched wide and still. If not for the broken porch light and the brittle memory of footsteps in the dark, I might have believed I'd imagined it all. I set the rifle aside and rubbed the sleep from my eyes. Then I stepped out onto the porch and stopped cold. A paper was pinned to the front door. It wasn't taped or folded neatly under the knob. Someone had stuck it there with a thumbtack, right through the center, like it was meant to mark the spot. I pulled it down and read it slowly, my breath leaving a trail across the page. Notice of violation. Printed in bold at the top, followed by a list of codes and subclauses that made about as much sense as a crooked fence. One was for failure to submit a change of occupancy request. Another mentioned improper outdoor storage. There was a third citing unauthorized structural modifications. I hadn't modified anything except the window I cracked open last night for air. At the bottom, it read, "You have 72 hours to comply or vacate. Further non-compliance will be reported to the county." It was signed with a looping scrawl. Karen Lewis, President, Pine Shore Lake HOA. I stared at it a while longer, as if the paper might change its story. It didn't. I folded it in half and tucked it into the back pocket with the deed. Then I walked the perimeter of the property slowly, noting every little thing she might have used against me. The pile of firewood stacked neatly beside the shed. The stack of shingles I planned to use for patching the roof. None of it looked like clutter to me. It looked like work waiting to be done. I drove into town around mid-morning. I needed fresh batteries and a new bulb for the porch. Maybe a padlock for the shed too. The hardware store sat just off Main Street, tucked between a feed shop and a laundromat. The place smelled like sawdust and old pine. A bell above the door gave a tired jingle as I stepped inside. Behind the counter stood a woman in her 60s with grey curls and reading glasses hanging from a lanyard. She looked up as I approached and gave a nod. "Morning, something you need?" "Just looking for a few things," I said. "Had a porch light busted and need a new bulb. Maybe some batteries too." Her gaze sharpened, and she stepped around the counter. "You new at the lake?" she asked. "Sort of. My family's cabin. Been in the family for decades." Her face didn't soften exactly, but something in her tone changed. "Karen been by yet?" I let out a breath. "More than once." She gave a dry chuckle and picked up a box of bulbs. She's got eyes on every lot within sight of that fancy deck of hers. Acts like it's her name on every deed. She left me a violation notice this morning, I said. Claimed I have 72 hours to fix things or get out. That got her attention. She's not the law, the woman said. She likes to play like she is, but all those letters and threats are noise. Had a young couple move in last spring, same routine. Karen posted notices, made calls, even tried to say their dog was a breed risk. They called the county. Turns out half her paperwork isn't even filed proper. She just scares folks off who don't know better. I nodded slowly, the weight of it settling in. She ever been stopped? I asked. The woman gave a long pause before answering. Not really. Most folks just leave. She wears them down. Sometimes I think that's her whole plan. I bought the bulb, batteries, and a heavy-duty lock. As she rang me up, she slid a card across the counter. That's Bill Harlow. Works down at the county recorder's office. You show him the deed, he'll back you up. Don't let her think she can push you around. I thanked her and stepped back out into the sun. On the drive home, I passed a few more houses I hadn't noticed before. Some with security signs in the windows, others with pristine lawns that looked like they'd never seen a child or a dog. It didn't feel like the lake I remembered. It felt like a gated community that forgot the gate. Back at the cabin, I changed the porch bulb, added the lock to the shed, and replaced the batteries in my flashlight. Then I sat on the steps with a sandwich and the violation notice folded neatly beside me. Karen wanted me to feel nervous. She wanted me to pack up and go. But every step she took only made me want to dig in deeper. 72 hours. That's what the paper said. I'd waited 12 years to come back here. I could wait a whole lot longer. The sun was just tipping past noon when I heard the crunch of tires on gravel again. I was splitting firewood out back, rhythm steady, each swing of the axe easing the knot between my shoulders. The logs cracked clean down the middle, landing with satisfying thumps beside the growing pile. It was honest work, the kind that made you feel like you'd earned the evening. I didn't stop right away when I heard her voice behind me. I warned you about the outdoor clutter. Karen stood with her hands on her hips, lips pressed in that tight little smile that never reached her eyes. Her pastel windbreaker was zipped halfway, clipboard tucked beneath one arm, and this time she had a phone in her hand, not held casually either. She wanted it to be seen. I rested the axe head on the stump and wiped my palms on my jeans. I'm not cluttering anything. I'm stacking firewood. You do remember winters get cold out here. Her nostrils flared slightly. The code is very clear about the storage of combustible materials, and your continued presence here without board approval is making several residents increasingly concerned. Concerned about what? A man fixing up his grandfather's cabin? Concerned about safety, she said, stepping closer. Concerned about people who show up unannounced, who don't introduce themselves at meetings, who don't make any effort to blend in. I let the silence stretch. Her gaze flicked to my hands, to the axe, then back to my face. She didn't flinch, but her grip on the phone tightened. I took a breath and picked up another log, splitting it clean with one swing. The sound echoed through the trees. Karen raised the phone higher and tapped the screen with her thumb. Since you refuse to comply with our requests, I'll be contacting the proper authorities. Maybe they can help you understand that this isn't just about one cabin. It's about community standards. You mean control, I said quietly. Her smile returned, thin and victorious. You'll want to be careful with your tone. This community has rules, and neighbors who look out for one another. She put the phone to her ear. I watched her walk back toward the gravel drive, voice sharp and practiced as she spoke into the phone. Yes, I need to report a trespasser. Male, possibly armed. I feel threatened. She looked back at me as she said it, making sure I could hear every word. I didn't move. I didn't raise my voice. I just leaned on the axe handle and waited. She ended the call and stood there, arms crossed. They'll be here shortly. I suggest you find your paperwork. I nodded once. Already have it. She tilted her head, then turned and walked off, her sneakers crunching with each step like applause only she could hear. I went inside, pulled the deed from the drawer, and set it on the table beside my ID. Then I sat down and waited. 20 minutes later, I heard the low hum of a car engine rolling up the road. Two of them. One marked cruiser, the other a plain SUV. I stood on the porch as they pulled up. The taller of the two officers stepped out first. Early 30s, pale, clean-cut, eyes hidden behind mirrored sunglasses. The second officer was younger, slightly shorter, hair buzzed tight against his scalp. They both looked fresh from academy posters. The tall one spoke first. "Sir, we received a report of a possible trespass situation. Mind if we ask you a few questions?" I gestured toward the table inside. "Not at all. Everything you need to see is right there." They stepped in, eyes scanning the cabin. I stood near the window, arms at my sides. The younger one flipped open the deed, glanced at my license, then back again. "This says you're the legal owner." "I am," I said. "Inherited it. Taxes are current. Everything filed with the county." The taller officer frowned slightly. "Karen Lewis claims there was no notice of occupancy filed. There's no law that says I need her permission to stay in a place I own." The two officers looked at each other. The younger one gave a slow nod. The taller officer turned to me. "You're within your rights to be here, but I'd advise keeping things calm. This neighborhood's a little high-strung." "Wasn't me that made the call," I said. He nodded, glanced around once more, then headed for the door. The younger one lingered a second longer. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "I think she's used to folks not pushing back." I didn't answer. He followed the other officer out. I stood on the porch and watched them drive off. Karen's curtains shifted slightly in the house down the hill. I didn't wave. I didn't smile. Let her watch. The blue lights rolled through the trees before the sound caught up. They washed over the pines and painted the lake in flashes. I had just finished stacking the last of the firewood when I saw them. 2 patrol cars this time, not one. Both turned into the narrow drive, tires kicking up dust, lights still spinning like something urgent was happening. I knew better. Karen didn't want me gone quietly. She wanted a show. I stepped off the porch, hands empty and open, and waited at the bottom of the steps. The doors opened slowly. 2 officers from before, but this time they were joined by a third. A woman, older, with silver at her temples and sharp eyes that didn't miss a thing. She didn't wear her authority like armor, but it clung to her all the same. The younger officer from the first visit gave me a nod. "Mr. Ellis." "Afternoon," I said. The tall one kept his hand near his belt, close to his radio. He didn't speak. The woman stepped forward. "Captain Reed, we received a second report today. Caller claims there was a confrontation. Raised voices. Threatening behavior." I nodded slowly. "From who?" She raised her eyebrows slightly. "Ms. Karen Lewis." I tilted my head toward her house. "Did she tell you what I said?" "She said you made her feel unsafe." "Did she say I never left the property line? That I was splitting wood?" "She mentioned an axe." That hung in the air longer than it should have. I kept my tone even. "I was working," I said. "She walked onto my property again. She made a call in front of me, said I was armed and threatening. That's not true." Reed looked past me at the woodpile, then at the shed, then back to the porch. Her face didn't give much away. "I've got ID," I said. "Deed's inside. Same one I showed your officers the last time." "May I see it?" I stepped inside and brought it out. Reed took it in both hands and read it carefully. She didn't rush. When she finished, she looked up at the tall officer. "He's listed," she said. "Filed properly. Nothing we can enforce here." He didn't answer. She turned back to me. "I'd still like to ask you to come down to the station. Voluntarily. Just to file a statement. It's standard now that we've had 2 calls." "I didn't do anything wrong." "I'm not saying you did," she said. "But if this keeps escalating, we need documentation. And if she keeps calling, we need to know what we're walking into." I nodded. I didn't like it, but I understood it. She took a step closer, lowered her voice. "Between you and me, this isn't the first time she's used us like her personal alarm system. I'm trying to keep this from turning into something worse." I looked over her shoulder, past the patrol cars, to Karen's house down the hill. Her front curtains moved just enough to catch my eye. She was watching. She wanted to see me leave with them. That was the whole point. "All right," I said. "I'll come, but I'm not signing anything without reading it first." Reed gave a small nod. "That's your right." We drove down together, me in the back of the lead car. Not cuffed, but not entirely free either. The station was clean and quiet, tucked beside the courthouse. They walked me through the front, no drama. A young officer at the desk offered me water. I declined. The statement was short. I wrote down what happened. When it was over, Reed read it silently and nodded again. "I don't think this needs to go any further," she said. "But I'll be honest with you. She's going to keep coming. She knows the rules well enough to dance around them. And as long as she doesn't step over a legal line, our hands stay tied. What do I do? Keep doing what you're doing. Document everything. Don't provoke. And if she shows up again, don't let it become a conversation." I stood. She offered her hand, and I shook it. Back at the cabin, the sun had started to dip again. The light was softer now, gold around the edges, the kind that makes the lake shimmer like it remembers something. I walked up the steps and sat down, the same porch beneath me, the same trees overhead. Nothing had changed. Not really. But something in me had settled. She could call all she wanted. She could dress it up in policy and posture, but I wasn't going anywhere. Not because I was angry, and not even because I had a point to prove. I stayed because I had every right to, because my grandfather's name was carved into the beam above the fireplace, because this land knew me, and because no one gets to steal a home by wearing down the one man willing to sit still and hold his ground. The next morning came with fog thick enough to swallow the dock. I stood on the porch with a mug in hand, watching the mist roll across the lake like it had someplace to be. The air was cool, still, and for a moment, nothing moved. Not the birds, not the trees, not the water. It felt like the world was waiting to see what came next. I made a list in my head of what I needed to fix. The porch steps were starting to sag, the gutter hung low over the kitchen window, and the roof could use a patch before the rains came. But the first real fix I needed wasn't something a hammer could touch. It was the root of the trouble, the thing Karen kept twisting just out of reach. Her voice and her rules had weight because people around here let them, and I wanted to know why. I drove back into town and found the real estate office. It was tucked into a strip mall beside a bank and a florist. The woman behind the desk wore a navy dress and a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She introduced herself as Teresa. "Looking to buy or sell?" she asked. "Neither," I said, just hoping for a bit of clarity. She looked at me over her glasses. "Clarity?" "About the HOA at Pine Shore. Karen Lewis, specifically." That got her attention. She set the papers in her hand aside and leaned forward. "You having problems already?" "She's been by every day since I arrived, calls the police, posts letters on my door, keeps quoting rules I can't find anywhere." Teresa nodded slowly. "You're not the first." She stood and walked to the filing cabinet behind her, pulled a folder out and flipped through a few sheets before handing me one. "That's a map of the original Pine Shore subdivision. Your grandfather's lot is right there. See that shaded section? That's the original footprint. No HOA. It was all private property. Voluntary association only. No binding contracts. But she says I fall under the new codes. She says a lot of things. 5 years ago, she convinced the new lakefront buyers to sign on to a stricter covenant. New construction only. High dues. Strict maintenance requirements. But the older properties? She can't enforce a thing. Not unless the owners signed on. I didn't. Then she's got no legal reach. She just talks louder than most." I folded the map and slipped it into my jacket. "Why doesn't anyone stop her?" Teresa gave a tired smile. "Some folks like the idea of order, even if the rules are pretend. And most of the people she targets don't have the time or stomach to fight. They leave. She swoops in, makes a low offer, or gets someone else to. Half of Pine Shore is owned by her friends now. So it's not about order. It's about control," Teresa said, "and keeping the place looking a certain way." I left the office with more than I came for. Back at the cabin, I laid the map out on the kitchen table and marked the boundary lines. She had no claim. None. And she knew it. But she also knew that most people didn't have time to visit courthouses or dig up county plats. She'd built her little kingdom on silence and intimidation. A truck pulled up later that afternoon, dusty and loud. I walked out to meet it. The man who stepped down was tall, built like he'd spent a life lifting things that didn't want to be lifted. His beard was short, grey-streaked, and his voice was low. "You, Ellis?" "That's me." "Name's Joe," he said. "Teresa sent me. Said you might need someone who knows the difference between a shingle and a snake." I shook his hand. You do roofing? I do most things if the pay's fair and the coffee's strong. I showed him the cabin. He nodded at the woodpile, looked over the beams, tapped the roofline with a practiced hand, said he'd be back Monday with supplies. As he pulled away, I caught sight of Karen's house through the trees. Her blinds shifted again, slow and deliberate. She had seen the truck. She had seen the man. That would be enough to stir her up again. Let her stir. I went back inside and made fresh coffee, spread the deed beside the map, sat down in the quiet of my own space, and began writing everything down, every visit, every letter, every word. Karen thought the cabin was a place to be conquered. She had forgotten it was a place built to last. The cabin had a way of holding memory that felt more solid than the beams above my head. I could trace my fingers along the windowsill and still feel the shape of my grandfather's calloused hands, the ones that built this place from the ground up with nothing more than sweat, borrowed tools, and an old army pension. Every floorboard creaked in the exact same spot it did when I was 6 years old, running barefoot through the living room while he warned me to slow down or catch a splinter. I never slowed down. Out by the lake, the dock had greyed with time but still stood strong. Grandad used to say good wood and good habits were the same, they held up under pressure. We spent mornings out there with cane poles and jelly sandwiches, the two of us saying more with silence than with words. I asked him once why he didn't sell the place when the developers started circling. He just looked at me, pulled in a catfish and said, "Because I know what this is worth even if they don't." Inside, above the fireplace, the beam still bore the carving he made the summer I turned 8. 2 letters and a date. EE 1961. He never was one for ceremony, so when he handed me the pocket knife and nodded at the wood, I knew it was my turn. I added my own initials just beside his. The carving was crooked, the lines shallow, but he stood behind me the whole time like I was writing scripture. That beam has held every winter since. In the kitchen, I found the old tin recipe box, rusted at the corners. Inside were scraps of paper with spidery handwriting, mostly his, bacon and beans, canned peaches boiled in butter, a chili recipe with no measurements, just words like a good handful and until it smells right. My grandmother's handwriting appeared in only one place-here list for cornbread written on a torn church bulletin. She died before I was old enough to know her, but I kept the paper anyway. The back bedroom still smelled faintly of cedar, though the boards had dried and cracked with time. The quilt on the bed was the same one she had sewn. Faded patches of blue and green stitched together by a woman I only knew through stories. Grandad never remarried. He said this place held her better than anyone else ever could. When I first came back, I expected the cabin to feel smaller than I remembered. It didn't. If anything, it felt bigger. It had grown into the space I left behind, filled in the gaps with silence and patience. There was no Wi-Fi, no TV, no locks worth mentioning, just 4 walls, a good roof, and a long memory. I lit the wood stove that evening just to hear it crackle. The scent of pine and smoke curled through the room, warm and familiar. I sat in the old chair by the window and watched the lake catch the last of the light. The water didn't judge or ask questions. It just reflected whatever stood before it. Same as always. I thought of my grandfather sitting in the same spot, boots off, socks drying by the fire, listening to the wind push through the trees. I remembered the day he told me the land doesn't belong to the loudest voice or the most paperwork. It belongs to the one who shows up every day, who keeps it standing, who understands that value can't always be priced. That's why the cabin matters. Not because it's pretty, or because it stands near the water, but because it holds something real, something earned. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the old compass he used to carry. The brass was tarnished, the needle slow to settle, but when it did, it pointed true, just like he always said it would. The sky began to turn not long after lunch. It started with a stillness, the kind that slips between the trees and pulls the sound right out of the air. The birds went quiet first. Then the wind followed, like it had somewhere better to be. I stepped outside and looked out across the lake. The water had darkened, smooth as glass, with clouds thickening above the far ridge like something brooding. I knew a storm was coming before the first rumble reached the cabin. You grow up out here, you learn to read the way light shifts and pressure settles. This one wasn't going to be kind. I moved fast, pulled the tarp tighter over the woodpile, checked the windows and braced the screen door. The sky dropped another shade darker. Then the wind came back all at once, hard and swirling, kicking up leaves and dust like it had a score to settle. Thunder cracked above the trees, loud enough to shake the porch. Then came the rain, sudden and heavy. It hit the roof in thick sheets and turned the dirt path into muck in minutes. The power snapped off not long after. No flicker, no warning. Just gone. I lit the lanterns and sat by the window, watching the trees sway and the lake thrash in the wind. Rain rolled down the glass in long streaks, and lightning split the sky every few minutes. It didn't bother me much. The stove still worked, and I had coffee in the percolator. But something about the way the storm rolled in made me feel watched again. Not by nature, but by the kind of eyes that come from behind curtains. The worst of it passed by late afternoon, leaving behind snapped branches, scattered debris, and a single pine down across the road near the bend. I walked out after the rain stopped and surveyed the damage. The cabin had held up fine, just a few loose shingles and one gutter hanging low. I grabbed a saw from the shed and went to check the roadblock. The tree had taken out part of the fence along the property edge. Nothing major. It would take some time to clear, but nothing I hadn't handled before. I was halfway through the trunk when I heard tires on gravel. I turned and saw her. Karen's silver SUV rolled to a stop just past the bend. She stepped out in dry shoes and a pressed raincoat, not a leaf or speck of mud on her. She didn't bother with pleasantries. "Was that your tree?" she asked, nodding toward the downed pine. "It was a tree," I said. "Didn't seem to ask for permission when it fell." She frowned. "It came from your lot. Took down part of the perimeter. I'm clearing it now." "That's not the point. We had an agreement about property standards. That includes preventing hazards. I never agreed to anything with you." She crossed her arms. "You're responsible for the damage, and for the power outage most likely." I stared at her. "You think I caused the storm? I think your carelessness with those wires near the shed is a risk to this community, a risk we cannot ignore." I leaned against the saw handle and let out a slow breath. "There are no exposed wires. I checked everything. The power line runs clean to the meter. If it's out, it's from the storm. You'll need to report any outdoor work to the HOA, she said, including tree removal. We can't have unauthorized activity that affects neighborhood safety." I didn't say anything, just looked down at the log, then back at her. "I'll be submitting a full report," she added. "This is strike 3. You should think seriously about whether this property suits you." I stepped forward, slow and even. "I already have," I said. "I belong here. My name's on the deed. My family's in the foundation of that cabin. You don't get to decide who's welcome." Her expression froze for just a second, then reset. "You'll hear from the board," she said. "I'll be here," I said, turning back to the saw. She stood for a moment longer, then climbed back into her car and pulled away. I watched the dust settle in the rain-soaked road behind her. The storm had passed, but something else was still brewing. Not in the sky, but right here at the edge of Pine Shore. I got back to work. I was tightening a gutter bracket when I heard the sound of tires on gravel again. Slower this time. No police lights, no HOA lecture on wheels. Just a steady engine, and a familiar rattle in the back axle. I stepped off the ladder and walked toward the drive as the truck rolled into view. It was green, older than mine, with a dent in the bumper, and a layer of dust like it had just come through 3 counties of back roads. The door opened, and a boot hit the ground. Then the other. My cousin Derek stood up straight, stretched his back, and gave me that sideways grin he always had when he was about to say something smart. "You gonna let me in or stand there pretending you're still surprised I showed up?" I walked over and pulled him into a hug. He smelled like engine oil and road miles. Same as always. "I thought you weren't getting out of Dallas till next week." "I wasn't. Then I got your message." "I didn't ask you to come." He gave a shrug. "Didn't need to." We sat on the porch later, drinking coffee, black and bitter, the way our granddad used to make it. Derek leaned back in the chair, boots crossed, eyes watching the trees like he was scanning for movement. Always alert. That military instinct never left him. It was one of the reasons I knew he wouldn't ask too many questions, at least not right away. "You weren't kidding," he said finally. "Place still feels like it belongs in a different time. Except for that house down the hill. Looks like it got dropped in from a real estate commercial." That's Karen's place, I said. Oh, a president, sheriff of nothing. She the one who's been calling the cops? I nodded. 3 times now. Posted a fake violation notice, filed a complaint, tried to say I caused the power outage. He took a slow sip, then set the mug down. She doing it 'cause she wants you gone, or 'cause she wants the place? Both, I think. She wants control, and she's not used to folks telling her no. Derek didn't say much after that. He just kept watching the road like he was waiting for her to try again. I didn't tell him about the broken porch light or the footsteps in the night. I didn't have to. He already knew. Derek didn't need words to understand pressure. He had felt it under fire. That night, we sat out again after the sun dropped behind the ridge. No music, no stories, just the crickets and the pop of the lantern flame. Karen's house glowed down the hill, all lit up and perfectly square, like it was trying to outshine the rest of the lake. Derek looked at it and shook his head. People forget, he said, that not everything gets to be a gated community. Some places are just meant to be lived in, not managed. He reached into his duffel and pulled out a pair of binoculars, then laid them on the table between us. In case she comes back creeping. I smiled. She'll see you and think I called in reinforcements. Derek didn't look over. Didn't you? We sat a little longer before calling it a night. When I turned off the lantern and stepped into the cabin behind him, I felt something shift. Not in the land or the house, but in me. A quiet kind of settling. I wasn't standing alone anymore. And Karen would see that soon enough. The meeting was set for Friday at 6, just as the sun began to slide down the far end of the lake and the breeze carried the smell of grill smoke and cut grass. I arrived a few minutes early, not because I was eager, but because I didn't want to walk into a room already decided. Derek came with me, though he stayed in the truck. He said if I needed him, all I had to do was nod through the window. That was his way, present without taking the stage. The community center sat just off the lake trail, a squat building with vinyl siding and a wraparound porch someone tried too hard to make look old. The windows were open, and inside I could see rows of folding chairs and a long table at the front. Karen stood near the head of it, talking to a man with a pressed shirt and a tired smile. Her clipboard was in her hand again, same as always. A few heads turned when I stepped through the door. I could feel it settle on me like heat in a closed room. Most of the faces were older. A couple young couples too, still wearing tennis shoes from walking their dogs. No one said anything. Karen caught my eye, and offered the kind of smile you reserve for people you think you've already beaten. "Mr. Ellis," she said, voice too smooth. "Glad you could join us." I nodded. Wouldn't miss it. She motioned toward the chairs. "We'll begin shortly. Please take a seat." I didn't sit right away. I walked past the front row and placed a manila folder down on the table. It held my deed, a copy of the county plat map, 2 signed statements from neighbors I'd spoken to in town, and a printout of Pine Shore's original charter. All of it legal, all of it quiet. I didn't need a speech. Karen looked down at it, then back up at me. Her mouth moved, but nothing came out for a second. I took my seat. The meeting opened with the usual reports. Dues collected, tree trimming schedules, a complaint about dogs off leash. Then Karen stood and cleared her throat. "We've had several disturbances on Lot 14A, she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Unregistered occupancy, property violations, and at least one incident requiring police involvement. For the safety and cohesion of our community, I believe we should open the floor to address the future of that lot, and whether it's in our best interest to issue a formal warning or recommend a removal procedure." There were murmurs, soft but uneasy. She looked directly at me, waiting. I stood slowly. "I've lived on that lot since the day I was born," I said. "I walked those woods with my grandfather, who built that cabin board by board. I inherited the land legally. The deed is filed. The taxes are paid. I didn't move in to bother anyone. I came back to take care of something that belongs to me." Someone from the back, a man in a ball cap, raised a hand. "He's right. That cabin's been there longer than this HOA. Long as I can remember." Another voice joined in, a woman with graying hair. "That's not a new structure. If it was, we might have a say. But it's not." Karen's smile faded. "I'm not asking for anyone's permission to live on my own land," I said. "I'm just asking to be left alone. And if someone wants to dispute that legally, I'll be ready." Karen stepped forward again, lifting a paper from her clipboard. "We're not here to target anyone," she said, "but community standards must be upheld. This isn't personal. It's about maintaining the integrity of Pine Shore." The man in the ball cap stood. "Feels personal," he said, "especially when the only one getting letters and visits is the man you never met before last week." Karen opened her mouth to speak, but a woman near the center beat her to it. "And you've tried this before, Karen, with the couple who had the camper, with the widower from Lot 6. Don't act like this is the first time." It went quiet again. Karen looked around the room and realized she'd lost it. She shifted her weight and gave a tight smile. "If anyone would like to review the documentation, it's available here. Otherwise, I suggest we close this matter and move forward." I stayed seated. I didn't need to win anything tonight. I just needed to hold my ground. They voted to dismiss the complaint. No one seconded the motion to pursue any action. Karen gathered her papers and didn't say another word. As I left the building, Derek gave a small wave from the truck. I nodded back. The wind off the lake was cool against my neck. It wasn't over. But tonight, something shifted. Not in the rules. In the people. The next morning, I found a letter rolled up and wedged into the handle of my front door. No envelope, no signature, just a single page with typed lines and a polite tone that didn't match the message. "Mr. Ellis, in light of recent community concerns, we ask that you refrain from any further work on your property without first submitting a request through the proper HOA channels. Unauthorized improvements will not be tolerated. Failure to comply may result in legal action." I read it twice, folded it, and placed it on the table next to the violation notice she'd posted earlier in the week. I wasn't angry anymore. That fire had come and gone. What remained now was steady, rooted, the kind of calm that sits deep in the bones. Karen was still trying to play her part, still trying to scare me off with words dressed in official language. But the crowd at the meeting had seen through it. The cracks were beginning to show. Later that day, I took a walk down to the small grocery store at the edge of the lake. They had a bulletin board by the entrance, covered with flyers for lawn services and babysitting offers. Right in the middle was a printed notice about upcoming improvements to community appearance standards, signed again by Karen. Someone had taken a black marker and written "Nope" across the bottom in bold letters. I was in the checkout line when I heard two men talking by the freezer case. One of them pointed out the window toward the parking lot. "She tried to fine the Barretts for repainting their shutters," one said. "They used the wrong shade of grey. Can you believe that? She threatened to have Larry's mailbox removed because it was too rural looking," the other replied. "I don't know who she thinks she is, but folks are getting tired of it." By the time I stepped outside, there was a woman waiting near my truck. She wore a red cardigan and jeans, hair tied back in a bun. She gave me a cautious smile. "You're Ellis, right? The one from the meeting?" "That's me." She held out her hand. "Maria, I'm on lot 7. I shook it. Her grip was firm. "I just wanted to say I'm glad you stood your ground," she said. "We've been dealing with her nonsense for years. Every time someone pushes back, she finds a way to bury them in paperwork or run them out. Not this time." She looked relieved. "Good, because people are starting to talk. She's got folks believing they don't have a choice. But we do." Later that week, a reporter from the local paper showed up. She was young, not more than 30, with a notepad in one hand and a recorder in the other. Said she'd heard about the HOA conflict and was doing a piece on property rights and overreach. "Can I ask you a few questions?" she said. "I've already spoken to 3 other residents, and your name keeps coming up." I offered her coffee and we sat on the porch. I told her everything from the first day Karen showed up, all the way through the false calls and the letter on my door. She took notes quietly, nodding now and then. When I handed her copies of the deed and the plat map, she looked surprised. "You're legally in the clear," she said. "Have been from the start. Why do you think she's doing this?" "Because I didn't bend," I said. "She's used to people backing down. If the rules don't stop you, the pressure will." The story ran 2 days later. The headline read, "Cabin owner challenges HOA overreach at Pine Shore." They used a photo of the lake with the cabin in the distance and quoted Karen in the second paragraph. Her words were short, defensive, and vague, but the quotes from other residents painted the clearer picture. She knocked on our door twice in 1 week to complain about garden gnomes, one said. She told my husband his fence was too aggressive, said another. Within hours, the paper's website was full of comments. Locals sharing their own stories. Some funny, others not. All of them pointed in the same direction. Karen's grip was slipping. By the time Friday came around, a petition was being passed around calling for a formal review of her position. 20 signatures the first day. More by nightfall. I didn't need to see her face to know she'd read the article. The curtains in her front window stayed drawn. No clipboard, no calls, just silence. Sometimes, silence says more than shouting ever could. I went back to the cabin and put another log on the fire. The wind off the lake felt different. Not softer exactly, but fairer. The kind that carried change. Not because I shouted, but because I stayed. The lake was glass again. The mornings had gone back to slow coffee, and the hum of crickets fading into birdsong. I could hear the soft splash of a fish now and then, feel the breeze lift off the water and drift across the porch. There was no hammering, no tire crunch on gravel, no forced visits or clipboard-wielding declarations. For the first time since I arrived, the quiet felt natural again. I spent the early part of the day fixing the screen door. The frame had warped slightly after the storm, and I had to plane the edge by hand to make it sit right. Grandad's tools still worked fine, same steel teeth, same wooden handles worn smooth by time. Every stroke of the file felt like another small act of settling in, not resisting, not bracing, just settling. Derek left that morning, a nod and a slap on the back before pulling down the lane. He didn't say much about it, but I knew he felt good knowing I had stood my ground. He left a fresh box of shells on the table next to the firewood and said he'd be back before the season changed. I told him I'd keep the coffee hot and the fire low. When I walked down to the dock that afternoon, I found a folded note sitting on the top step. No name, just a simple message in blue ink. Glad you stayed. That was it, but it was enough. Later, as the sun dipped behind the trees and painted the water in gold, a few neighbors passed by on the walking trail. One of them waved, another tipped his hat. A woman walking a dog stopped just long enough to say, "Cabin's looking good." I thanked her and meant it. That evening, I sat by the fire with my feet up and the door open. The wind moved through the trees with that old rhythm I remembered from my childhood, the one that made it feel like the whole forest was breathing slow and deep. I didn't need music. I didn't need the news. I just needed that firelight, the distant hoot of an owl, and the space to breathe again. The cabin didn't feel like a fortress anymore. It felt like home. The county letter came on a Tuesday, tucked inside a plain white envelope with no return address, just my name and the cabin's. I opened it at the table where my grandfather used to drink his coffee and fix radios. Inside was a single sheet confirming what I already knew in my bones. The property had been lawfully transferred, taxes had been paid on time, and the Pine Shore HOA held no legal authority over Lot 14A. It was quiet on the page, just ink and approval, but it settled something deep in me. I folded it carefully and slipped it into the drawer beside the deed, right where Grandad used to keep his compass and pocket knife. Nothing loud, nothing dramatic. Just one more stone laid down in a path that was always mine to walk. A few days later, I was sweeping off the porch when I heard the sound of footsteps, not hurrying, not sneaking, just steady and slow. I looked up to see a man standing at the bottom of the steps, middle-aged, wearing work boots and a flannel shirt. He carried a small pie tin covered in foil. "You Ellis?" he asked. "That's me. I'm Pete. My wife and I live up near the bend. We've been watching things play out. Figured it was time we introduced ourselves proper." He handed me the pie, still warm. "Blueberry," he said. "She makes it better than anybody. We're glad you didn't leave." I nodded and smiled. Me too. We talked a while on the porch. Nothing heavy. Just weather, fishing, and the best bait for the lake this time of year. He said others would probably stop by soon. Folks who'd been quiet but weren't unfriendly. Just cautious. Karen had ruled with a smile and a threat for so long that people forgot they could think for themselves. When he left, I set the pie on the windowsill and stood for a while, looking out at the water. The air had shifted, not just in temperature, but in tone. I felt it in the breeze, heard it in the rhythm of the waves. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of understanding. Inside, the cabin felt lived in again. Tools lined up on the shelf, boots by the door, a stack of split wood, waiting for the stove. I dusted off the old clock on the mantel and wound it for the first time in years. The tick was slow and steady, like breath, like memory. I opened the drawer and pulled out the compass. Its brass was dulled with age, the lid scratched, but when I flipped it open, the needle still pointed true. I set it on the windowsill beside the pie and watched the sun catch on its face. Later that evening, I took a walk down to the shoreline. The dock groaned a little beneath my steps, same as always. I sat on the edge with my legs dangling over the water, just like I used to when I was a boy. The lake was still, except for a few ripples from the breeze. I could almost hear Grandad's voice beside me, low and quiet. "This place doesn't ask for much," he once told me. "Just that you show up, take care of it, and don't let anyone steal what matters." I stayed out there until the stars came up and the sky stretched wide and black above the trees. The wind whispered through the pines, and the cabin lights glowed behind me like a promise kept. This place had weathered more than storms. It had stood through time, loss, and silence, and now it stood through challenge. I walked back up the path slow, every step sure. The cabin didn't need defending anymore. It just needed someone who wouldn't run, and I was never leaving again.